Aloha, everyone. Welcome to the Hawaiian Kingdom series, the history, the church, and the land. Before we get started today, I'm going to pass it actually to Linda Rich to make a short cameo and just give a statement for us, and then we'll get started.
Aloha, everyone. I'm actually in Oklahoma still, but I wanted to make a brief statement regarding a recent communication that some of you may have received from the Hawaii Conference Minister David Popham, or you may have seen in the Coconut Wireless, the Hawaii Conference's UCC online newsletter, an advisory regarding Kingdom of Hawaii bonds. The message stated that the IRS had contacted the conference office and had advised that that the conference expressed to churches and to individuals the need for caution if they were approached regarding these bonds. The communication started out by saying that the Justice and Witness Missional team of the Hawaii Conference was presenting a Hawaiian history series that featured Dr. Keanu Sai. And it also mentioned in the advisory that he was the person who was signing the bonds. So I wanted to say a few things here. One is that the communication from Dr. Popham could be misunderstood to imply that Hawaiian Kingdom bonds have been promoted by this series. I've also heard concerns being expressed that Justice and Witness Missional Team funds have been or might be committed to those bonds. Neither of those concerns is true. The communication advises caution, which I think is good advice in making decisions about any investment. I would encourage you to go to the Hawaiian Kingdom website if you have questions about the bonds and draw your own conclusions. The details are very clearly explained. For those who accept that the nation of Hawaii exists as an occupied country, the decision may differ from that of those who consider Hawaii to be legitimately a part of the United States. I want to emphasize again that this series intentionally puts forward Hawaiian history from the perspective of the Hawaiian Kingdom's history as documented through archived materials, including newly translated documents. Many of us are hearing history that is different or more complete than the history written by those who overthrew the government and benefited from the Americanization of the Hawaiian Islands. The Americanized history dominated our education system for many decades. We are also hearing about international law challenges to the legality of the US annexation of Hawaii. We also note that the United States Congress apologized without adequately addressing the issue of Hawaiian sovereignty. I also would like to point out that Dr. Sai is not a lone voice in putting forth the concept of the continued sovereignty of the Hawaiian nation. I offer you this quote from another esteemed Hawaiian scholar, Dr. Noe Silva, professor of political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She says, "The Kanaka Maoli continue to protest today. We have never relinquished our national sovereignty. Kanaka Maoli are working on state, national, and international levels to have our existence as a nation recognized. Kanaka Maoli also continue to resist and protest every encroachment upon our inherent rights to this land, our ocean and fresh waters, and all the other natural resources of Hawaii. We are insisting as well on our rights to keep our language, our cultural traditions, and the land itself alive." We must hear, end quote. We must hear and acknowledge these voices if we are ever to bring reconciliation within our church. I hope this series is challenging all of us to examine our assumptions and the accuracy or incompleteness of history we learned earlier in our lives, and that it is pushing us out of our comfort zone as we continue to learn and consider what justice and reconciliation require. Now, having said what I had to say, I sincerely hope that you will spend this next hour listening to the wisdom that will be shared by Kumu Donovan Preza and not let these issues distract from the presentation he has prepared this afternoon. Please give Kumu Donovan the respect and courtesy he deserves and be attentive to what he has to share today. There will be opportunities at a later date to engage in more discussion of the many issues that have been raised during these sessions. Mahalo and aloha.
Mahalo, Linda, for dropping in from Oklahoma in another time zone to make that statement for us. And now we'll kind of transition into our presentation. So we are 11 weeks deep now in our Hawaiian Kingdom series, hosted jointly by the Justice and Witness Task Force, which I'm a part of, as well as the Association of Hawaiian Evangelical Churches. So before we get into our presentation for today, I've asked Kahu Ron if he could open us in Pule. So Kahu Ron, when you're ready.
Pule kako. Ke akua. We come to you and thank you for this opportunity to learn new things, to learn the truth, to struggle with our beliefs, and to see where you would lead us to go. We thank you for being in this beautiful place in Hawaii with its beauty and uniqueness for us to enjoy and share. We thank you for the presentations that have been given to us. We ask your special blessings upon Kumu Donovan Preza and his wisdom that he has learned over the years. Maybe we be united in our drive to seek for the truth. And thank you for providing us with this special opportunity to learn together. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus, whom we call the Christ. Amen.
Mahalo. Kumu Donovan, all yours.
Okay. Aloha mai kako. First off, mahalo Linda for that very fair and appropriate summary you gave or introduction you gave. So mahalo. Like to start off today with a passage from a book, Hawaii Story, Hawaii Queen, Queen Lily o Kalani. O honest Americans, as Christians, hear me for my downtrodden people. Their form of government is as dear to them as yours is precious to you. Quite as warmly as you love your country, so they love theirs. With all your godly possessions, covering a territory so immense that there yet remain parts unexplored, possessing islands that, although near at hand, had to be neutral ground in time of war. Do not covet the little vineyard of Naboth's, so far from your shores, lest the punishment of Ahab fall upon you, if not in your day, in that of your children. For be not deceived, God is not mocked. The people to whom your fathers spoke of the living God and taught to call Father, and whom the sons now seek to despoil and destroy, are crying aloud to him in their time of trouble. And he will keep his promise, and he will listen to the voices of his Hawaiian children lamenting for their homes. Title of my presentation today is Naboth's Vineyard, the Crown Lands Transmutation from Private to Public Property. And Naboth's Vineyard is a story about the king of Israel, Ahab, who covets a vineyard next to his, and that's owned by a regular farmer, Naboth. God's law at that time was that any inherited lands could not be sold, right? So when King Ahab approached Naboth to purchase his vineyard, Naboth told him that it was not possible, not sell his vineyard to King Ahab, even if he wanted to, right? Because there was this law that you could not sell inherited lands, and his vineyard he had inherited from his father. So Ahab went home, told his wife Jezebel, and Jezebel reaction to Ahab was one of mockery. She mocked his ineffectiveness and basically said, "Are you not the king? How can you not just make this happen? Go ahead and make this happen." So she went ahead, devised a plan, accused Naboth of crimes against God that he did not commit. Naboth was sentenced and punished and eventually killed. After his death, Ahab acquired Naboth's vineyard. Then there's a series of prophecies, and Elijah comes down and talks to Ahab and talks about his sin and that he killed an innocent man using the justice system. Ahab repented and God showed mercy on him, but he also said, none of your family will continue this dynasty, so to speak, right? And there's other prophecies that are involved where, dogs will lick your bones and so on and so forth. And what happens at the end of that story is Jezebel's killed and her body is eaten by dogs, and her bones are eaten by dogs. And none of Ahab's sons come to reign or become king in those lands, right? So this is the story that Queen Kalani is referencing. And on the one hand, Naboth's vineyard, generally speaking, is Hawaii. The more specific reference is to that of the Crown Lands or the King's Lands, right? In this case, the King's Lands are Naboth's vineyard. It's that piece of land that's coveted by those in power that cannot be sold to them. So what do? Make up a story, use the law to punish those people, and gain power and gain access to those lands that way, right? It's like you couldn't have written this in a movie, so to speak, right? Like you'd almost believe like, oh no, this is too close to home in a lot of ways. So today is that story, the Crown Lands Transmutation from private to public property. Remember that reference to transmutation, right? That's not my word. That's something we're going to circle back on, or we're going to call back to. John Chinen, author of The Great Mahele. All right, the most important event in the reformation of the land system in Hawaii was the Great Mahele of 1848. However, the Great Mahele is still surrounded by confusion and misunderstanding, right? And this is in 1957. Other scholars, Canalora, who wrote a book for security title, made a similar statement about the Mahele. And the Mahele is one of the most misunderstood events in Hawaiian history. And part of that is because I think the only approach that can be used to understand the Mahele is an archival approach. If you're reading secondary sources, you're not going to figure out the story, right? I seen Ron Williams in the room earlier, and this isn't for all of you who are familiar with Ron's work. I'll use Ron as kind of that metaphor. You see what hours and hours and decades of archival research, the stories that are unearthed in that technique, in that methodology, right? And in doing so, you have to read thousands and 10,000s of Hawaiian documents in order to construct and build the understanding. There is no book out there that I can point you to that says, here's the accurate factual understanding of the Mahele process, not the historical interpretations, the Mahele process. Here's what people were saying, and here's from a title perspective, right? All of our secondary sources out there on historical and what were the results and what were the effects of the Mahele. Very few secondary sources have provided an understanding of the Mahele from a title perspective. And for one, because you have to read thousands of archival documents. For two, there's a lot of illegality upon which our current situation is built upon, right? If you look at Hawaiian history, this kind of three-legged stool that Hawaiian history sits on is one of illegality. The 1887 bayonet constitution, implying an illegal at forced constitution, non-constitutionally ratified constitution. That's a fact, not an opinion. The 1893 illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian government, right? There's an apology by the United States using that language of an illegal overthrow, right? That's a fact, not an opinion. And the illegal annexation of Hawaii, right? So this three-legged stool is also part of this misunderstanding, because our current right? It's that metaphor of the fruit of the poisonous tree, right? You can't get a legal act from an illegal source. And here in Hawaii, we have three illegal sources, one affecting constitutional law, another affecting governance, and another affecting annexation and merger or non-merger with another country, right? So this is the context within which this sits, right? There's lots at stake. And today, the story of the Konohiki Lands we're going to focus today on the Crown Lands, because that's 25% of Hawaii. And if I had to generalize, it's the one story that explains our current reality with land, and why foreigners hold a lot of land and why Hawaiians do not. Quick review from previous weeks. The Mahele event occurred between January 27th and March 7th of 1848. In that, Kauikeoli, acting as a chief, not as representative of a government, divides out the rights of the chiefs. 252 Konohiki receive 1.5 million acres. Kauikeoli, the highest ranking chief, receives 2.5 million acres. And within each pieces of this pie, we still have the rights of the government, and we still have the rights of the native tenants. But at this point, the rights of the chiefs have been divided through the Mahele. The day after the Mahele, March 8th, 1848, Kauikeoli takes those 2.5 million acres and divides between the two hats that he's wearing. On the one hand, he's the highest ranking Konohiki. On the other hand, he's the representative of government, right? He previously was the absolute monarch, right? Right now, he's the head of state. That division leads us with two conceptual categories. One, the king's lands. Two, the government lands. All right, to introduce a metaphor to help make this a little more palatable, the king's lands are Donald Trump's Trump plazas, his golf courses, his personal private property. Government lands, that's the White House. That's your national parks and other land belonging to the country, right? So here we have the king's lands, the private property of Kauikeoli, and you have the government lands, of which all proceeds go to the treasury for the benefit of all the citizenry of Hawaii. The other conceptual category that gets created here is the Konohiki Lands, and this is our Ali'i Trust. This is Lunalilo Homes, Queen Liliuokalani Children's Center, this is Kamehameha Schools, Bishop Estate. You name your Ali'i estate, and it comes from that peach part of the pie, right? As part of this process, a majority of the chiefs gave back approximately 500,000 acres of land. They commuted, exchanged. In exchange, they received the fee simple title or the government's interest for that small 500,000 acre piece of pie, right? It was, think of it as a lease to fee conversion, because their rights at that moment, the government still had their rights in land and they had to commute or exchange for those rights. After payment of commutation, you now have the Konohiki owning in fee simple 1 million acres of land, the government owning in fee simple 2 million acres of land, and the king's owning his land as his private property in fee simple 1 million acres of land, right? The orange and the peach are private property, i.e. George Bush's ranch in Texas, Obama's house in Illinois, Trump Plaza, and the green is public property, the White House. And this leaves us with our summary pie chart. The king owning 1 million acres in his private capacity, the government 2 million acres, the 252 Konohiki owning 1 million acres in fee simple, and there being approximately 28,000 acres of Kuleana lands in fee simple. We've gone over the specifics of this breakdown in our previous presentation, the Great Mahelean Overview, and also our government lands presentation. So if this part of the presentation was fast for you, I would implore you to go and watch those 2 previous videos, which will bring you up to speed to this point. Today's story is going to focus on the Konohiki lands, which are the orange and the peach, right? Because the king is both a Konohiki, the highest ranking chief, and head of state. In this context, we're talking about him in his private capacity as highest ranking chief, or his private property, George Bush's ranch in Texas. From the Constitution, there are but 3 classes having vested rights in land. First, the government, second, the Konohiki, third, the native tenants. When you divide out the rights of each of those classes, you get these conceptual categories of original title. These categories being government lands, king or crown lands, Konohiki lands, and Kuleana lands, right? Another example of Konohiki lands, which we aren't going to focus on today, but is worthy of a presentation on its own because it answers different questions. For example, it answers the question, did Hawaiians get land as a result of the Mahele? And this, people can go and look at Carlos Andrade's book, Ha'ena, right? And Ha'ena is the story of Konohiki lands and how the Maka'ainana of Ha'ena purchased an entire ahupua'a through the creation of a hui. And in that hui, they huied up together and bought an entire ahupua'a from the Konohiki, right? And they created their own bylaws and in essence ran that ahupua'a in the traditional system using the hui mechanism, right? I believe there are others. I believe Hawaii had a similar story with huis, and the huis in and of themselves are stories of Hawaiians getting land, right? Not through the Kuleana Act, not through their purchase of government lands, but through the direct purchase from a Konohiki. Right, so there are multiple stories. There's 252 Konohiki. That means there's at least 252 stories to be told. Many a master's thesis and PhD ripe for the exploration there. Right. Today we're going to focus on the King's Lands, which eventually, after 1864, become called the Crown Lands, and we'll get into that transition in a bit. All right, Actually, we'll get into it now. If we take a look at what happened to the land between 1846 and 1893, last week we covered the red portion of the pie, which was the fee simple purchase of government lands up until 1893. And in that, we saw that ranches were buying a lot of acreage and Hawaiians were buying a lot of small parcels between 1 to 50 acres, right? Today, we're going to focus on the orange. And what was happening with the orange or the crown lands was between 1848 and 1865, that purple portion had been sold. Nobody's added up that number. Somebody would have to go do that research to give us a number. I estimate it to be at approximately 100,000 acres. But that's just through simple math. Someone would need to verify that. So by 1865, Kamehameha IV dies, Alexander Liholiho dies, and his brother Lot Kapuaiva ascends to the throne. He then approaches the legislature and says, can you make these lands inalienable? That means unavailable for sale. right? So that was his worry, was that purple portion would keep growing and eventually all of the crown lands would be sold. So he approached the legislature in 1865, and in January, a law was passed making the crown lands inalienable. That means the crown lands are unavailable for sale, right? On a smaller scale, this was done recently in New Zealand, where New Zealand, I think 2 years ago, passed a law that said you can no longer sell New Zealand land to non-New Zealand citizens. You can no longer sell land to aliens, right? You have to be a New Zealand citizen to purchase New Zealand land. That didn't make all of New Zealand's land change conceptual categories. It's still fee simple, but now you have a reservation on the sale. You cannot sell to particular entities. In Hawaii, a similar thing happened, but it was more broad than that. You could not sell to anyone, right? As a result, you had the creation of the Crown Land Commission. Between 1865 and 1893, that 900,000 acres was only available for lease. And the Crown Land Commission on Leases is the entity that was in charge of administering those leases. The entity that leases nearly all 900,000 acres of the Crown Lands is Sugar. Sugar was not buying the red. The purchase of the red portion of the pie was your cattle, was your ranches, right? Ranching was the dominant economy before the 1870s, before William Penn discovered oil in Pennsylvania, which then slowed whaling and the need for whale oil in Hawaii. That reduction in the need for whaling and whale oil then reduced the need for cattle products, because on their way to the Aleutian Islands, they were stopping on Hawaii, reprovisioning with cattle products, with salted beef and other cattle products on their way up to the Aleutian North Pacific. 1870 rolls around, demand for whaling oil goes down, demand for sugar starts to rise. During this period, Sugar is leasing, not buying the Crown Lands. Why? Because you could not purchase the Crown Lands, because in 1865, the Crown Lands were made inalienable by Lot Kapuaiwa Kamehameha V. So in 1865 and 1893, Sugar has leases for the Crown Lands. This is also an economic advantage for them because they don't have to have a high upfront capital expense to purchase 50,000 or 100,000 acres. Come to find out the sun's not right, the soil's not right, the water's not right, the transportation's not right, the labor's not right. Right? So they were leasing, and that's going to be that portion of the pie, that 900,000 acres of Crown Lands is Naboth's vineyard, right? Because Sugar leases those 900,000 acres, those 900,000 acres become very valuable and prove their productivity. And then what happens? Now people, Sugar, covet lands that they cannot purchase. Why can they not purchase these lands? Because they were made inalienable in 1865. This is the allusion, and this is the reference to Naboth's vineyard, the coveting of lands which you cannot buy by law, right? Whether it be God's law or in this case, Hawaiian Kingdom law. So this is the transmutation, and you see it in the naming, right? The king's lands become the crown lands, and that is just a name change, so to speak, all right? But then these crown lands become the public lands, right? And that's where the transmutation occurs, right? Transmutation means to change something into something else, right? This is Rumpelstiltskin's story. Let me turn lead into gold. How do I turn lead into gold? How do I turn the private property? How do I turn Trump Plaza into the White House, right? And this is that transmutation from private to public property. And this is where it's very important to understand this distinction between private and public property. What is the difference between Trump Plaza and the White House? While Donald Trump was president, he had usage of the White House. After his presidency was over, he did not. They did not become his private property. Trump Plaza and all of his golf courses did not become public property, right? But somehow in Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani's private property got transmuted into public property. And that's the part of this story that many people don't understand. It's like one day it was ours, the next day it wasn't. I don't know. Who knows what happened in between, right? This is that story of what happened in between. Little more summary. What does the Mahele mean? To divide, what's being divided, rights in land. Who has rights in land? According to the Constitution, though it was not his own private property, it belonged to the chiefs and people in common, right? Of whom Kamehameha I was the head. This is where we get the refinement of this idea of undivided interest and the principles of the Land Commission. There are but three classes of persons having vested rights in the land. First, the government, second, the landlord, third, the tenant, right? Government, Konohiki, Maka. I'm skipping through this quickly because we went over all of this in the first two presentations. Okay. Who has rights in land? First, the government, second, the chiefs, third, the native tenants. And all of this is not my opinion. You can find it in the 1839 Declaration of Rights, the 1840 Constitution, and the 1846 Principles of the Land Commission. And this is back to the significance of Hawaii being in control of its own sovereignty and being in control of its own country. They were able to codify their customs into constitutional law, something that other indigenous peoples around the world were not afforded that luxury because they were not in charge of their governance, right? This is the difference between being colonized by another country, and the difference of being an independent state. Hawaii had control of the reins, right? And they were able to then codify their custom into law, which thus becomes the foundation for all the illegalities that happen afterwards, right? Something's not illegal unless a legal precedent is first established. So what do the Constitution say about the king's lands, right? 1840, prerogatives of the king. He also shall retain his own private lands, and lands forfeited for the non-payment of taxes shall revert to him, right? So here's a specific reference to his private lands, right? Whatever his private lands are, they shall belong to him. 1852, Article 41. A little bit stronger. The king's private lands and other property are inviolable. Right? The king's private lands are inviolable. You cannot violate the king's private property. 1864, Article 39. The king's private lands and other property are inviolable. Right? These are the three constitutionally ratified constitutions of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Then we get to the 1887 Bayonet Constitution, right? This was the constitution that was forced upon Kalakaua, right? At gunpoint, the bayonet constitution, the knife at the end of the rifle, the bayonet, the king's private lands and other property are inviolable. What do you think happens? Just take for a second to silently think to yourself, what happens to this clause in the 1887 Constitution? It's removed. It is literally the only article which in its entirety is removed. There are other articles that are edited and changed. There are other articles that are added, but Article 39 from the 1864 Constitution is literally the only article that was removed in its entirety. All right, so now you see 1887 is now setting the stage for something to happen to the king's private lands, because now they are no longer constitutionally protected, which means now you may be, in the future, you may be able to violate what was once inviolable. And we'll take a look at what happens to that. This is where it's really important to understand the causes of the Mahele and why did we need the Mahele in the first place, right? If you come from the perspective of the Mahele was a foreign imposition and the Mahele was not a Hawaiian thing, then you are probably not going to ask this question. And this is the significance of perspective. If you hold one perspective, you ask and answer very different questions than if you hold a different perspective, right? Why did there are many books out there that ask and answer the question, why did the foreigners want the Mahele? Very few scholars have asked, why did Kamehameha III want the Mahele? Why did the king of this country want private property? Luckily for us, if you read, and if you're an archival researcher, you can find the answer to that question, right? Court case 2 Hawaii 715. The records of His Majesty in council, Privy Council, show plainly His Majesty's anxious desire to free his lands from the burden of being considered public domain, and as such, subjected to the danger of confiscation in the event of his islands being seized by any foreign power. Right? So this is the importance of public versus private property. When prior to 1848, prior to the creation of private property, everything was public lands which belonged to the absolute monarch, Kamehameha III. So had any country came in and took over Hawaii, they then, under international law and custom of that time, would have assumed ownership of all of the public, right? You can kind of see this today with the Russian annexation of Ukraine, right? That annexation through warfare was outlawed in the 1930s with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, right? Which is why it's such, apart from the war side, just from the international law perspective, is so untenable, right? No one has taken since the 1930s through war and acquired more territory. That was outlawed with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, right? But during this era in the 1840s, you could take over a country and all public lands would then be yours. All right, so the question to keep in your head is, all right, does this make this public or private property? As we saw previous, he's worried about it being considered public domain and wants it to be private because private is respected and won't be confiscated in the event of his island being seized by a foreign power. Right, so here you see, according to the court, the intent for Kauikeoli, one of the reasons for him wanting the Mahele was to make lands private, because private property is respected in the event of imperial conquest in the 19th century. And all of this is articulated in these different law books, all of which are mentioned in Privy Council, all of which the Hawaiian Kingdom has in their hand at that time. Right? Elements of international law, Henry Wheaton, commentaries on the laws of England, Blackstone, commentaries on American law, James Kent, Montesquieu, Joseph Booth, others, right? All of these books are being talked about in Privy Council, and they have these books and they're reading these books. And what's articulated in these books is the general usage now is not to touch private property upon land without making compensation. If a country goes in and takes over another country, public lands get confiscated, private property is respected and remains in the hands of the private land owner. Right? And this is articulated in Kent's Commentaries on American Law, 1826. They have this explicit conversation December 18th, 1847 in Privy Council. This is 1 month before the Mahele. The Mahele, the Great Mahele, that pie chart we just saw happens in January of 1 month later. If a foreign power should take the islands, what lands would they respect? William Little Lee gave it as his opinion that conquest by any foreign power, the king's right to his private lands would be respected. All right, so here you see that public-private distinction. The king said, unless it were so, he would prefer having no lands whatsoever. But he asked, during the French Revolution, were not the king's lands confiscated? And William Little Lee replied to yes, but that was a different story because that was an internal revolution. That wasn't foreign powers coming over and taking revenge. So internal French revolutionaries took the king's lands, which was a different thing than an outside power coming in. The king observed that he would prefer that his private land should be registered not in a separate book, but in the same book as all other allodial titles, and that the only separate book should be that of government lands. The king wants one land with government property and one land with other allodial fee simple private property in it. That's the distinction he wants. One book of public property and one book of private property. He's trying to make this very clear and obvious distinction between what is public and what is private. What is George Bush's ranch in Texas? What is the White House and the national parks? So as we can see, Kamehameha III's intent is to make a distinction between public and private, and for his lands to be considered private property. Here we have that distinction, going back to this pie chart, that's Kawi Keoli making this distinction between breaking that 2.5 million acres, one for himself in his private capacity and one for the government in the public capacity. All of this was recorded in the Mahele book of 1848, Buke Kakaupa'a. In this book, on the left-hand side, you have the lands belonging to Kamehameha III. On the right side, you have one of 252 chiefs, and you have the name, the Ahupua'a, the Kalana, and the island that you can find all of those on, right? Hawaii transitions to private property with this list of place names. There is no map to reference, right? It's this list of place names. I hereby agree to this division. It is satisfactory. The lands above are the king's. I have no right to them. I hereby agree to this division. It is satisfactory. The lands above inscribed are Victoria Kama'amalu's. She has permission to take them before the Land Commission. Right? So it's at this point that the Land Commission then starts to investigate Konohiki Lands. Prior to the Mahele of 1848, they're not looking at Konohiki Lands, right? Just like when you start a job, you initially have one set of responsibilities. A year passes, you get more responsibilities. As time passed, 2 years later, after the creation of the Land Commission, they used the Land Commission to then make title for the Konohikis. As a result, Kawi Keoli creates two different instruments. The day after the Mahele, he takes what is articulated in that book in one running list and divides that running list into two separate documents, two quote unquote books, if you will, right? The first instrument is the king's lands, the king's private property. George Bush's ranch in Texas, right? And in that, he writes, and all of these lands will belong to me, for me and my heirs and successors forever. The second instrument is that for the government lands or public property, do hereby give, make over, and set apart forever to the chiefs and people of my kingdom, and convey all right and interest in the lands on pages 179 to 225 to have and to hold to my chiefs and people forever. This is to the government. This is the public property. This is to the country. All right. First instrument, for me and my heirs and successors forever, my private property. Second instrument, I give this lands on page 179 to 225 to my chiefs and people forever, to the government. And this is the creation of the government lands and aforementioned king's lands. So here we see Kamehameha III is interested in creating his king's lands as his private property, because he understands public property will be confiscated in the event of imperial conquest. The legislature, although this doesn't have legal ratification or legal authority, the legislature on June 7th affirms this, expressing our deepest thanks to His Majesty of this noble and truly royal gift. We do hereby solemnly confirm this great act of our good King and declare the following named lands to be the private lands of His Majesty Kamehameha III, right? To be regulated and disposed of according to his royal will and pleasure, subject only to the rights of tenants, right? So here you see, even the legislature understands these lands to be the private property of the king. So here we have the orange, private, the peach, private, the green, public. If a foreign power, if Britain were to come into Hawaii and take over Hawaii, hypothetically, they would only have claim as conqueror to the green. The orange and the peach would be respected as private property. 1864, Kamehameha IV passes. A few months after the passage of Crown Prince, he dies unexpectedly. As a result of dying unexpectedly, he does not have a will. As he dies without a will, there is a question: what happens to the Crown Lands? This question is taken up by the Hawaiian Kingdom Supreme Court and is adjudicated in regard to the estate of Kamehameha IV. This is a court case that is Lot Kapuaiwa against the Kamehameha IV's widow, Queen Emma. In order to understand this court case, you have to understand the Civil Code and inheritance law. According to the Civil Code, section 1447, whenever any person shall die intestate within this kingdom, his property, both real and personal, shall descend to and be divided as hereafter prescribed. Right? Kamehameha IV dies without a will. What happens to his lands follows section 1447 of the Civil Code. I'm going to skip through this kind of quick because I'm running short on time. The gist of this is, according to section 1448, it first goes to your children. There are no children in this case. If no children, then it goes to the children's children. His child did not have a child, therefore not applicable. If no children or no children's children, then half goes to the widow and half to his mother and father. So what is essentially being argued here is that if you follow section 1448, Kamehameha IV dies without a will. As such, his private lands, which are the Crown Lands in this case, over 900,000 acres, half of that should go to Queen Emma and the other half to his father, because his mother had passed at this time. All right. So that's the ramifications of this. If we follow the inheritance laws, Lot Kapuaiwa, Kamehameha V, inherits nothing. I'm going to skip this on dower, but dower is also part of the story. If we take a look at Kamehameha V's argument, he claims that the Crown Lands are an appanage of the crown, that they're connected to, they're attached to the crown, like how the White House is attached to the presidency, right? When you become the president of the United States, you have the right to the usage of, they're attached to that office, right? He argues that it's the royal domain annexed to the Hawaiian crown. As such, Lot Kapuaiwa is essentially arguing that the Crown Lands are government property. And as government property, they are therefore not subject to dower and not subject to inheritance law. So section 1448 that we just looked at, not applicable. This should descend to, they're attached to the crown. Queen Emma, she argues that no, this is private property. And as private property, it should be distributable under the statute regulating the descent of private property, like all other private estates. Right? So here you see her saying, yes, this is private property, therefore subject to dower, subject to inheritance laws. Right? So philosophically, they're saying two different things. One is saying this is private property. The other is saying this is government property. Each of those different ramifications has or arguments has ramifications for whether or not you follow inheritance law, and therefore who gets these lands. If we compare these side by side, taking a look at I have plus and minus as a matter of consistency, not a moral judgment of good or bad, right? According to Kameme V's claim of government property, the plus of that would be that Kameme V would inherit the Crown Lands, and that would be consistent with to my heirs and successors forever, right? So it's consistent, not a moral good or bad judgment. The negative or the inconsistency is that Lot Kapuaiva is claiming that this is government property. And everything we've seen to this point, even Kamehameha III's words himself, say, I wanted to create private property, right? Queen Emma's, her argument is consistent with these have always been treated as private property. So it's consistent with that, but the inconsistency is that there's nothing left for the successor to inherit. By Kamehameha IV not making a will, 900,000 acres no longer gets inherited by the next king and queen. It gets inherited by his widow and father. So 900,000 acres would leave the crown, so to speak. So the crux of this is, what is for me and my heirs and successors forever mean? What was the purpose and intent? What was Kauikeoli doing when he wrote that clause? Some other additional evidence for private property, and I'm going to go through this real quick, just for time's sake. Kamehameha III sold land as his private property. This is recorded in the Bureau of Conveyances, where all other sales by private individuals are recorded. These aren't recorded in government grants or government deeds or government templates for the sale of government land like other royal portent grants are, right? This is recorded in the Bureau of Conveyances like everything else. Kamehameha III acknowledged Kalama's right to dower. Kamehameha IV acknowledged Kalama's right to dower and paid money to her for her dower. Queen Emma signed each deed, relinquishing her rights to dower. Kamehameha IV sold land. All of Kamehameha III and IV and their wives are treating this as private property, not as government property. Right? So everybody's actions to this point is that this is private property. To Hawaii 715, Judge Roberson decides this. Under that act, the lands descend in fee. The inheritance, however, being limited, however, to the successors to the throne. Right, so a couple of key words here for the legal people. The inheritance being limited, however, to successors to the throne, and each successive possessor may regulate and dispose of the same according to his will and pleasure as private property, in like manner as was done by Kamehameha III. So the ruling of the court by Judge Roberson in 2 Hawaii 715 is that the king's lands are private property, the inheritance, however, limited to successors to the throne. This is a concept that is not taught in American law because American law does not acknowledge this. This is more a remnant of British common law than it is American common law. In the British common law system, they come from a genealogy where back in the 1700s, the inheritance of my land would be limited to my eldest son. my firstborn was a daughter and my secondborn was a son, it would go to my son, not to my daughter. That concept is called a fee tail. When the inheritance is limited to a specific entity that is no longer fee simple, inherited generally by anyone, that is called a fee tail. That idea of a fee tail is not acknowledged in American property law and is essentially not taught, in the sense that they don't have to learn things that aren't part of passing the American bar, right? So this concept doesn't exist in American property law, right? Exists in a British common law, this concept of fee tail, limiting the inheritance. But the important thing is the court acknowledges this is private property in fee with a limitation on inheritance. All right. So what you essentially have happen here is arguably the best of both worlds in terms of consistency. On the one hand, the king's lands for me and my heirs and successors forever, successors to the crown inherit this 900,000 acres, and this land is still private property, and as such, subject to dower, right? So this court case for me by Judge Roberson is actually, I think, a spot on court case when you look at this through the lens of purpose and intent. Kamehameha III's purpose was for his heirs and successors, but then this gets qualified to, this is his heirs and successors to the throne, not the heirs and successors to his body. This isn't inherited generally by all of my children. This is inherited by whoever is on the throne. And this is how it jumps from the Kamehameha line to the Kalakaua and Liliuokalani line, right? This is how it goes from Lot to Lunalilo, and then from Lunalilo and the Kamehameha line to the Kalakaua line, right? And then to Liliuo. Is this just all historical? After the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom government in 1893, a quote-unquote new constitution is written, and that new constitution, by those who overthrew the government in 1893, in Article 95, writes this: that portion of the public domain heretofore known as the Crown Lands is hereby declared to have been heretofore and now to be the property of the Hawaiian government, and to now be free and clear from any trust of or concerning the same from all claims of any nature whatsoever upon the rents, issues, and profits thereof. It shall be subject to alienation and other uses as may be provided by law. All valid leases thereof now in existence are hereby confirmed. Is transmutation. Here is turning lead into gold. Here is turning a lease into fee simple private property. Here is turning private property into public property, right? And this is all done through the pen, right? Not with the sword, not with the gun. This is all through the power of the pen. That portion of the public domain, heretofore known as the Crown Lands, you should have a record scratch right there, right? Public domain, those lands were never public domain. Those lands were always private domain. That portion of the public domain, heretofore known as the Crown Lands, is hereby declared to have been and now to be the property of the Hawaiian government. Think about that for a second. Everybody in attendance for this presentation, I hereby declare that all of your land and your private property is now mine. Please mail me your car keys and your house keys. It all belongs to me. I hereby declare. That is how 25% of Hawaii was stolen. And it's right here in plain sight. Don't trust me, but go and verify that Article 95 of the 1894 indeed says what I'm saying it says. right? They hereby declare private property to be public, right? The irony is this is a violation of the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. This would not fly anywhere in America, right? Fifth Amendment, nor shall private property be taken for public uses without just compensation, right? If you need a piece of land for rail, okay, you can claim eminent domain, but you got to pay them for it. Here is just a declaration without that second half of payment. They took 25% of Hawaii. And they took it because these are the lands that they're leasing, and these are the lands that they could not purchase because in 1865, a law was passed to make the Crown Lands inalienable, which means unavailable for sale. The Crown Lands are Naboth's Vineyard. Lands that were coveted by those in power who wanted to purchase them but could not, therefore had to do scrupulous acts of illegality to go and get them. And it's all documented, not a matter of opinion. Right here, Article 95 says it, not my opinion. I hereby declare your land to be mine. Right? He shall retain his own private lands. The king's private lands are inviolable. The king's private lands are inviolable. 1887, you get a bayonet constitution, which removes that clause. And in 1894, with the new government, you have Article 95 now declares private to be public. I'm almost done. I know I'm over. I got 5 more minutes. Judge Fenton Booth in United States, Liliu takes this to court in the United States in 1910. And this is his verdict. Although the Hawaiian Kingdom Court in 1864 sustained the right of dower in the widow of the king, it is clear from the opinion that the Crown Lands are treated as, we should all be saying private lands in our head, but what Fenton Booth says is, right? This is Judge Robertson's decisions as private property. Fenton Booth says Crown Lands are treated not as the king's private property in the strict sense of the word. They belong to the office and not to the individual. And this is where you have the transmutation, and this is where you have, how do you make an illegal act legal? And this is the problem that judges, as Judge Fenton Booth is running into in 1910, how do you make an illegal act legal? How do judges today make illegal acts legal? How do you make the illegal overthrow of the government and the illegal annexation and the bayonet constitution legal, right? And it's through this kind of massaging of language. Not as the king's private property in the strict sense of the word. They belonged to the office. No, they didn't belong to the office. They were inherited by. The inheritance being limited, however, to successors to the throne. They didn't belong to has the connotation, if something belongs to me, I own it, or it's mine. I don't own something until I inherit it, right? In this case. And this is where the shifting of language, right? In December 23rd, 1994, Judge Emeritus Samuel P. King writes about this, and the history of the Crown Lands may determine their future. This is an open editorial in 1994 in the Star Bulletin. In the course of rewriting history and correcting past wrongs, as a start, it would not be unjust for the state of Hawaii, whatever left of the Crown Lands. Stop yourself right there. Why would a Judge Emeritus commenting on in an open editorial talking about the Crown Lands say it would not be unjust for you to give back the Crown Lands? Answer, because we don't own it. In the course of rewriting history and correcting past wrongs, as a start, it would not be unjust for the state of Hawaii to transfer whatever is left of the Crown Lands, one half to the trustees, the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Estate, and 1/2 to the Queen's Hospital for its health programs. Settlement for the rest of the Crown Lands could follow in due course, right? Why would you return the Crown Lands if you own them lawfully, right? The only reason to return the Crown Lands, 1/2 to entity A and 1/2 to entity B, is because you never owned them in the first place. And that's the story of 25% of Hawaii. And it's that 25% of Hawaii that is the contemporary wealth in land today, right? This is the sugar lands. This is Big Five. This is those lands. That's how those large landholders got their land today. This is all the sugar lands that are getting converted into affordable housing today, right? This is the genealogy of that story. Sorry, Cassie, I know I'm over, but.
No, thank you very much. Well, we have one question in the chat here. If folks have other questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. So someone had asked, any bloodline, i.e. heirs, can claim land, or only the one who became crowned?
For Jocelyn, this question is layered, right? If you're talking strictly inheritance of the Crown Lands, then it's just heirs to the crown, right? If you're going to pull in a subject to the rights of native tenants and native tenant rights and some other kind of argument, then others beyond the bloodline, I would say, could have a claim to, could make an argument for that. But in a strict context, only a successor to the crown, right? Because that it's inherited by successors to the crown, not successors to his body. So none of the bloodline heirs of the Kamehamehas, right? Because then would it also be the Kalakaua line and Lili'u line who could have claim, because they owned it, right? So it's successors to the throne. And that's where, without a monarch in power, who brings that lawsuit.
Thank you. Our next question is from our previous presenter, actually, Kumuran. He asked, is it clear that neither the provisional government nor the Republic had any legal claim to the Crown Lands for several reasons, most foundational being that they were not legal government, recognized under false circumstances, and never a transfer of sovereignty? But what if a revolution led by Kanaka Olivi overthrew the monarchy and established a republic for some, such as Robert Kalani Wilcox argued for? Would the Crown Lands then pass to the president of this constitutional republic, perhaps Wilcox, or upon the end of monarchy, would the lands then switch to descending to the genealogical line of the last monarch?
Of course, Ron asks like the most complicated, nuanced question. So this is an interesting one, right? Because it depends on what your source of authority is on the one hand, right? Are you going to 64 Constitution or are you going to 87? Because in those different constitutions, they also have provisions about form of government, right? I believe 1864 Constitution says the form of government is a constitutional monarchy. And then in 1887, that's removed. And then I believe 87 says something to effect the form of government is a republic, right? So if you're going to go with 87 Constitution, then I could see an argument for a president of a republic being, because it's consistent with the authority of the Constitution from which you're deriving authority. If 87 is not constitutionally ratified and is therefore not a lawful constitution, and 64 is then the governing constitution, that says that your governing and your form of government is a constitutional monarchy. So could it go to a president of a republic when the Constitution says, but like, this is like, we're in the super weeds with that part, right? Like, you ask a very good question, but highly nuanced in the weeds that will go above most common lay people's understanding right now. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Does it appear that there is a forward political momentum to have the King's Land, Crown Lands, ceded lands ever be legally returned to the Hawaiian Kingdom?
Does it appear that there's a forward political? Sorry, I'm one who has to read questions. I can't hear them verbally and process them fully. That there is a forward political momentum. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of different momentums for for me. I think the return of the Crown Lands in a lot of ways is the low-hanging fruit. It's kind of the easy thing, so to speak, because the state of Hawaii knows it doesn't own it lawfully as a matter of title without any issues of sovereignty. Just you took private property for public use without compensation. That's illegal under American law. It's illegal under Hawaiian Kingdom law. It's illegal, right? So Judge Samuel King acknowledged in his editorial, hey, we should return these lands to the Hawaiian people. His solution was to return it to Kamehameha schools. Later in that op-ed, he said, or better yet, give it to OHA and let OHA figure it out. So, I mean, yeah, there's lots of momentum to return the Crown Lands, but I don't, if you're being strict with law here, I don't think Trump Plaza doesn't belong to American citizens. So why would you return Trump Plaza to American citizens? Like the King's Lands belongs to a private individual who happens to be the king. Why do I have a claim to that as a makainana, as a, like, that's not mine. That's, you know, I have no more right to your lands, Keone, than I do to the Crown Lands, right? That's out of, but I get it. It's the only thing that's left. It's the low-hanging fruit. It doesn't belong to the state, so it should come to the people. We've been suffering for 127 years. I get those kind of practical arguments, but I also don't think it's hono or consistent with the longer term who those lands belong to. You know, I'm strict in these senses, right? Like, for me, they belong to the successor to the crown. When we have someone in the crown, those 900,000 acres go to that guy or girl, or that it goes to that person who's in that office. In my mind, I don't have a claim to that, but that's just me. Others want to solve practical problems today. I don't want to have a solution today that muddies the waters for those in the futures. And I think that's doing things with the Crown Lands unnecessarily muddies the waters for the future. The Crown Lands are already complicated. What do you do with someone who just didn't know any of this history and bought a quarter-acre house just to feed their family, just to live in Hawaii and feed their family? And you're going to go take that away from them, right? Because strict black and white law, it doesn't belong to the entity, right? So it's like, this is very complicated problems, and I think we're only starting to grasp the nuance of it. And it gets complicated when we want to have current today fixes, which then complicate the long-term outlook.
So someone asked, can we get a copy of the list of the 252 elite lands that you showed?
Yeah, the Mahele book, the Mahele book. Can you get a list from me? I think that was from Jocelyn, right? Yes, Jocelyn, you can get a list from me, but one can also derive and create a list for themselves by going to the Hawaii State Archives and downloading their digital copy of the Mahele book, and then going and counting all of the names and keeping and putting a list of those names into an Excel sheet and right, like, and I say this to Jocelyn because she knows I've been wanting to make a research group that goes and does that and does this kind of land research. So those who don't know the context or that story should know that I'm not being snide to Jocelyn or anyone. Yes, I know we will make that research group and we will make those lists.
Thank you. If someone currently owns property on Crown Lands today, what is the legal remedy, if any? Restitution from the occupying country?
Good question. And arguably nobody's asked that question prior, right? And I don't mean like literally, and I'm the first one to ask, but only now are we starting to ask different questions about the Mahele. And this is why it's so important. Your perspective is important. If you think the Mahele is a foreign imposition, you're not going to ask that question because you're not asking why Kamehameha III wanted it, which means you're not focusing on this public versus private. And if you don't focus on the public versus private, that goes over your head. Article 94 goes over your head. And it's just this confusion. Well, it was once ours and now it's theirs, right? And so this is where perspective is really important, and what questions you answer are really important. And not to avoid your question, but like this is very few people ask that question. And so we don't have a lot of thinking and a lot of research on it because it's complicated. It's 25% of Hawaii, and it's most of the land that we're on today. It's not the mountains and the watersheds. It's the land with structures and buildings and farms on it. So it gets super complicated. What I would say to that question is I would prefer to not allow those entities to hand off the bag, so to speak, to a third party, to where we then have to deal with the third party. I would rather deal with the entity that has genealogy to this 1893 and 1894 Constitution and have benefited from that for the last 100 years, because once they pass the bag, then it makes this even more complicated for us to fix and figure out, because it's not that third party's fault. But if we don't know that that's the history and we don't hold them accountable to that, we're gonna, if I'm them, I'm selling all of the Crown Lands. I'm passing it off and I'm gonna let all of you in this room deal with the third parties and the people who bought houses, and I will have my money and I will be gone. That's what I would do.
Someone asked about, what about the island of Ni'ihau?
Island Ni'ihau was purchased, royal patent grant, fee simple sale of government lands before. That was, Ni'ihau was given to the government in the Mahele book and was sold as a royal patent grant in 63. So different thing, not Crown Lands.
Is illegal overthrow considered a conquest?
No, and the United States of America has never claimed conquest. They've claimed lawful annexation, right? They've claimed that, no, we annexed you through the joint resolution of annexation. Even the United States of America does not claim conquest. And that was the significance of Liliuokalani standing down and not reacting to, and maybe even all of those rebellions, right? Because had there been any legitimate rebellion, America could have then claimed conquest through the fighting of that war, right? But there was, I think, literally only one bullet shot, and that was the gun is at the archives. I've seen that gun, and because Lili'u did not fight, I think that is why today we can claim no conquest. I think had Lili'u fought, then we may have won that battle, but when they sent the troops, we would have lost that war. And that's where I think the political savvy of Liliuokalani at that time to take the path of Hina rather than coup at that moment, I think was diplomacy. I think diplomacy is why we can stand on the legal foundation that we can today. For some, that's unsatisfactory because there's no quote unquote teeth to it. but I would rather have that legacy than none.
How did the Homestead Act of 1895 further complicate the situation?
Yeah, Homestead Act is also part of this. The Homestead Act, I'm not trying to absolve Dole in this comment, but Dole was not the same kind of Dole was very different than Thurston. He had a little bit more morals, if you will. Thurston was just, it's illegal, I don't care, go do it. We're gonna get this. And so Dole was actually more Thomas Jeffersonian in his political ideology. He was you build a country on the backs of small farmers. So the Homestead Act of 1895 was an articulation of that, and he tried to encourage yeoman farmers from America to come to Hawaii. Problem was they couldn't encourage them with government lands because they had sold the majority of government lands. And that's the Naboth's Vineyard are covered by different entities. The Crown Lands are coveted by one, the United States of America, for military bases. You name your military base, it's probably on Crown Lands. Waimanalo, Crown Lands, right? Bellows Air Force Base. Kahawiki, Fort Shafter, Crown Lands. Schofield Barracks, Waianai-Uka, Crown Lands, right? You name your military outpost, it's probably on Crown Lands. So military coveted coveted Crown Lands for military bases. Sanford Dole coveted the Crown Lands for homesteads because he believed you build a country on the back of small farmers. That's the lots from 1 to 50 acres. For those of you who are familiar, that's the public land survey system. These eastings are these townships and ranges, and right, the north where Iowa and the Midwest and all of that, where you have these long tracts of 50-acre farms and farm lots. In the south, you had the plantations, right? In the north, you had the small farmer. In the south, in America, you had the plantation owners, and then you had a civil war between these two people with these two different ideologies of people with farms versus large landowners with cheap labor, plantations. And then the third entity was Sugar, and Sugar was the one who was leasing the Crown Lands. So these three different entities all had their eye on the same prize, and that prize and those political ideologies all coalesced into this illegal coercion, yeah, I'll back you up, act to violate the inviolable.
Okay, I think maybe our final question for today is, can the green area public lands be taken by foreign power?
Yes, prior to 1930, right? In 1930, the Kellogg-Briand Act was passed, and according to international law and custom, after that time, countries stopped acquiring territory through conquest. Right. But prior to 1930, yes, the public land, the green area in the graph, which was public property as opposed to private, could have been taken by a foreign power. And prior to that, everything would have been green, right? Prior to the Mahele of 1848, everything was public. It belonged to the absolute monarch, Kamehameha III. Right. So had the Paulette affair in 1843 not played out the way it did with the return of Hawaiian sovereignty, all 4.2 million acres would have went to the King of England, and we would have all been buying land from him, hopefully.
Well, mahalo Kumu Donovan for the presentation today and for answering all these questions. I also want to mahalo everybody for submitting questions and participating in this discussion. That concludes our presentation for today, and we will have our final presentation, the 12th of our series, next Sunday to wrap up. So mahalo everyone, and take care. Have a good Sunday. Aloha.